Welcome to Awakened Calm. You have been betrayed before. Maybe it was a friend who promised loyalty but disappeared when you needed them most. Maybe it was a partner whose words sounded true until actions revealed the opposite. Or maybe it was a leader, a company, or even a government that convinced you to believe only to leave you standing in the ruins of broken promises. Betrayal does not just wound in the moment. It lingers. It shapes how you walk into every room, how you look at every face, how you question every smile. It teaches you to be careful to hold back to protect yourself. And yet deep inside there is a part of you that still longs to trust again. Imagine for a moment a village that had given up on trust altogether. No one greeted strangers. No child laughed freely in the open square. Every eye carried suspicion, every gesture was guarded, every word was measured. This was a community living under the heavy shadow of deception, fractured not just in spirit, but in the very fabric of daily life. Into this silence walked a single traveler, not a warrior or a priest, not even a wealthy merchant with treasures to dazzle the crowd. His name was Aaron. He carried nothing more than a wooden cart and a way of being that would quietly change everything. What if I told you that this man never preached forgiveness? He never gave lectures about letting go or sermons about moving on. He never demanded that anyone believe him. Instead, he did something far more radical, something we rarely see in a world that thrives on selling images, quick fixes, and polished promises. He remained still. He remained honest. He remained himself. And in that simple act, he opened a door for others to rediscover what it meant to believe in truth again. Now, before you dismiss this as an old story from a distant past, think about your own world. Think about workplaces where trust is fragile, where promotions are promised but never delivered. Think about friendships that feel more like transactions than bonds. Think about a digital age where every image can be filtered, every word spun, every truth hidden behind clever marketing. In that kind of world, what does honesty look like? What does trust even mean anymore? This story is not just about an ancient village. It is about us. It is about how we living in cities, from New York to London, from Toronto to Berlin, from Los Angeles to Paris, can find a way back to authenticity in a time when deception feels ordinary. The journey you are about to take is not about returning to the past. It is about reclaiming a strength that has always been within reach, but too often forgotten, the power of presence, of truth that does not need to be defended, and of trust that is built not through words but through consistency. So stay with this story, because what happened when Aaron sat by the village well will not only surprise you, it may change the way you respond to every betrayal you have ever faced. The road stretched out like an endless ribbon of ochre dust glowing beneath the late afternoon Sunday. Heat shimmered above the earth as if the sky itself were breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called its cry, cutting through the silence like a blade. This was not the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was the silence of people holding back, the silence of suspicion, of watchful eyes hiding behind shuttered windows. The village lay ahead, pressed against the horizon. Its houses leaned into one another like weary companions. Roofs patched with straw and clay carried the stains of too many storms. Smoke from cooking fires rose, but even that carried a heaviness, curling slowly as if reluctant to rise. The whole place felt like it was caught in a pause, as though the world had asked it to wait for something that never came. Along the road walked a man who seemed to move differently than anyone else. His pace was steady, not fast and not slow, as if time itself had bent to his rhythm. He pushed a simple wooden cart, its wheels groaning softly under the weight of plain goods covered with coarse cloth. A pair of oxen lumbered beside him, their bells chiming in a pattern that felt less like noise and more like music, something ancient and reassuring. The man's name was Aaron. Few would have guessed it then, but his presence would shift the fate of everyone who crossed his path. Aaron did not look remarkable. His clothes were the kind of garments any traveler might wear, a rough tunic the color of earth sandals worn from miles of walking, a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Yet there was something in the way he carried himself that made him unforgettable. His shoulders did not sag under invisible burdens. His eyes did not dart with the restless hunger of a man eager to sell or deceive. Instead, there was a calm stillness about him, like a tree rooted deep enough to withstand every storm. The villagers noticed him before he noticed them. A woman carrying water from the well caught sight of the cart and froze, her hands tightening around the handle of her clay pot. Her eyes flickered with something that looked like hope, but quickly dimmed into caution. She turned away, her steps quickening, the pot pressed tight against her chest, as though guarding against another disappointment. A man repairing his roof paused mid-swing, hammer, raised gaze fixed on the stranger. His face held that familiar look of someone who has learned to expect little and trust even less. His children called to him from below, but he ignored them, staring as though trying to read this newcomer's soul from a distance. Even the dogs seemed different. They did not bark in the usual way when strangers passed. Instead, they kept close to doorways, hackles raised, but tails low, caught between curiosity and fear. The village had been betrayed before, too many times, too deeply. Promises had been made by others who came down this same road with carts full of goods and tongues full of sweet words. Those promises had turned to dust, leaving bitterness behind. Clay pots that cracked after one use, cloth that bled its colors, and stained hands. Herbs sold as cures that healed nothing. Each deception had left a scar, and those scars had become walls. Now Aaron approached these walls not with speeches, not with charms, but with the same quiet steps he had always walked. His oxen matched his pace, their bells carrying across the dusty square. The sound was steady, grounding, unlike the shrill cries of merchants shouting their wares. This was different, and though no one would admit it aloud, everyone felt it. Aaron's journey that day was not only across miles of road, but across centuries of human instinct. Suspicion is older than memory. It rises whenever trust has been broken. And in this village, suspicion had become a way of life. Children were taught not to speak to strangers. Elders warned against generosity. Hope itself had been treated like a dangerous indulgence. To hope was to risk heartbreak, and heartbreak was a luxury no one here could afford anymore. As Aaron drew closer, the village revealed its wounds in subtle ways. Laundry hung on lines, but the colors had faded unevenly, reminders of dyes that had bled when rain came. Broken tools lay beside houses rusting from neglect. Even the well, once the heart of the community, stood strangely deserted. People no longer gathered there to share stories or laughter. They fetched their water quickly and returned home without lingering. The road beneath Aaron's sandals crumbled into powder, yet his steps did not falter. He seemed to notice every detail, though he never stared. A bird perched on a sagging roof, the sway of reeds near the edge of the square, the way shadows lengthened as the sun sank lower. He absorbed these things the way one might breathe naturally and without effort. It was as if he carried a rhythm within him that nothing outside could disturb. This was what made him different. In a world where most people bent themselves into shapes to please others, Aaron remained himself. He did not quicken his pace to appear eager. He did not smile too widely to seem trustworthy. He did not glance around nervously to prove he had nothing to hide. He simply walked. And in that simple act, something extraordinary began to take root. For those watching, it was almost disorienting. They expected tricks. They expected grand gestures. They expected the kind of performance every merchant before had given. Yet here was a man who offered none of that. His silence was louder than speeches. His presence was steadier than any promise. A young boy crouched behind a fence, peeking out with wide eyes. He tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering questions, but she pulled him back with a sharp warning. Trust was not a game, and children could not be allowed to play with it. Yet even as she pulled him inside, the boy's eyes lingered on the stranger, drawn to something he could not explain. The oxen slowed as the road curved toward the well. Aaron guided them with a light touch, his hands resting easily on the wooden yoke. He did not speak to them, yet they obeyed. Animals, after all, sense more than words. They felt the calm in him, and they mirrored it. By the time he reached the center of the square, a small crowd had gathered at a distance. No one came close. They stood in doorways or leaned on fences, pretending to be busy but stealing glances. The square itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the man would reveal his intentions. Every villager carried the memory of betrayal like a stone in the chest. They expected him to unpack the cart, to shout about miracle goods, to bargain and persuade. But Aaron did not. He did not rush to prove himself or to erase their doubts. He simply stopped near the well, let the oxen rest, and placed his hands gently on the cart. Then he looked up, not at anyone in particular, but at the open sky, as though acknowledging something greater than the moment. The stillness unsettled them. It was unfamiliar. In their world, every silence demanded to be filled, every space exploited, every pause turned into a pitch. Yet this man's silence was not empty. It was full of a presence that made them feel both uneasy and curious. A blacksmith leaned on his hammer, sweat glistening on his brow, his strikes against the anvil slowing as he watched. A mother clutching her child whispered words too soft to hear, eyes flickering between fear and intrigue. An elder sweeping the square paused broom mid-air, his gaze fixed on the traveler by the well. Aran neither invited nor rejected their attention. He simply let it exist. He allowed their suspicion to wash over him without resistance, without defense. And in doing so, he gave them something no one had given them in a long time: space. Space to feel whatever they felt without being manipulated. The sun dipped lower, bathing the square in amber light. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. The air thickened with the smell of rice, cooking of wood smoke, drifting lazily. Life continued, yet beneath its surface, something had begun to shift. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. A little girl clutched a cracked clay cup in her hands, watching from behind her father's leg. Her eyes, unburdened by years of betrayal, saw not the same dangers as the adults, but something else. Curiosity, wonder, a possibility that maybe this stranger was different. And so, as evening gathered around the village, Aaron remained at the well, a figure of calm amid a community that had forgotten what calm looked like. His presence was not a demand, not a command, but an invitation. And though no one had yet stepped forward, the first threads of change were already being woven into the fabric of the village. The stage was set. The walls of suspicion had not crumbled, but they had been touched by the faintest crack. All because one man chose to enter without masks, without force, and without fear. The silence in the village was not empty. It was filled with ghosts. They were not the kind that haunt with rattling chains or dark shadows, but the kind that live inside every cautious glance and half-spoken word. Betrayal had settled here like dust, fine and invisible, coating everything until no one remembered what clean air felt like. Aran stood by the well as the villagers lingered in their own distance. He could feel it even without looking at their faces. Distrust pulsed in the air, thick as smoke. It clung to the houses, the fences, the worn tools left unattended. He knew it well because he had seen it before in other places, in other lives. The signs were always the same. There were no children running to chase each other in the square. Childhood laughter, that spontaneous music of any healthy community, had been pressed into silence. Mothers pulled their children indoors too quickly, as though fresh air itself carried danger. Even the dogs, creatures who normally announced arrivals with great noise, seemed subdued, pacing with restless unease. A man sat outside his home repairing a net. His hands moved, but not with the ease of long practice. Every stitch was tighter than necessary. The thread pulled too hard, as if his effort could hold together not just rope, but life itself. Another woman scrubbed clothes against a board, her knuckles raw, her jaw clenched, as though she were trying to erase stains that had less to do with fabric and more to do with memory. The signs were everywhere. A pile of broken pottery stacked against a wall, not discarded but not repaired, either symbols of promises that had failed. A line of dyed cloth with blotched colors, reminders of goods that had been sold with false claims. A jar of herbs left by a doorstep, its contents dried to uselessness. Abandoned after some healer or merchant had sworn it would cure, and it did not. This was not just a place of daily survival. It was a place where hope itself had been betrayed. And betrayal is a wound that cuts deeper than hunger or poverty, because it fractures the foundation of trust that holds people together. Without trust, a village is no longer a village. It becomes a collection of houses with walls higher than the people who live within them. Aaron studied none of these things openly, yet he absorbed them all. He did not need to stare at broken pottery to know what it meant. He did not need to ask about the faded cloth to understand the disappointment it carried. He could feel the weight of it in the way people moved, in the hesitation of their steps, in the way their eyes slipped away from his, and then circled back again as though unable to look for too long. The damage was not just material, it was spiritual. A farmer who cannot trust his seed will never sow with a full heart. A child who cannot trust a smile will grow into an adult who cannot trust love. A neighbor who cannot trust another neighbor will close his door even when a storm comes. This is what betrayal does. It is not a single moment of deceit. It is an infection that spreads quiet and unseen until it touches every corner of life. For the villagers, the infection had grown so deep that they no longer knew how to imagine a different way. Suspicion had become their armor, and like any armor, it was heavy. They carried it everywhere, weighed down without realizing how much it slowed them. Aaron understood. He knew that suspicion is the child of pain, and pain does not dissolve when ordered to. It lingers until it has been witnessed. So he did not try to push against their walls. He did not rush forward with explanations. He did not plead for their belief. He simply allowed their suspicion to be what it was. This was the first lesson he carried with him, though he never spoke it aloud. When people have been hurt, they do not need to be told how to feel. They need space to feel it. To deny their suspicion would only deepen it. To demand their trust would only remind them of those who had demanded before and then betrayed. A blacksmith's hammer rang out in the square, sharp and hard, louder than necessary. The sound carried a kind of anger, not directed at the iron beneath his hand, but at the life that had deceived him. With every strike, he seemed to say, "I will not be fooled again." A mother's voice called her children in from the edge of the square, her tone carrying fear disguised as sternness. An elder swept the same patch of dirt again and again, an act that looked like work but was really a way to keep from meeting anyone's gaze. These were small behaviors, but together they painted the portrait of a place that had been broken. Betrayal had taken away, not just trust in others, but trust in themselves. Because when you have been deceived, it is not only the deceiver you doubt. You begin to doubt your own judgment. You begin to wonder if your heart can be trusted, if your instincts are wrong, if your hope is foolish. That doubt can hollow a person more completely than hunger. Aaron remained still. His cart sat beside him, the oxen resting quietly, chewing the last of their fodder. He watched the evening sun lower itself across the rooftops, painting the clay walls in warm tones. Life in the village continued, but the undercurrent of suspicion did not leave. It hovered like a fog. He could almost hear the whispers in their minds. Another stranger, another promise, another disappointment waiting to happen. He understood it. He even respected it, because suspicion, though heavy, had kept them alive. It was the shield they raised to protect what little was left of their hearts. But he also knew something else. Suspicion can protect, but it cannot heal. Walls can guard against new wounds, but they cannot mend old ones. Healing requires a different kind of strength, a strength that does not force or demand but simply endures. In many ways, the village was not unique. Betrayal wears different costumes in different places, but its effect is always the same. In one city, it is a corporation that promises security but discards workers when profit dips. In another, it is a government that swears loyalty to its people but sells their trust for power. In families, it can be a parent who fails to protect a partner, who abandons a friend, who gossips instead of guarding. The costumes change, but the fracture remains. The villagers were simply living the universal human story of broken trust. As the air cooled, some dared to linger near the edges of the square. Their bodies tilted slightly toward him, though their feet did not move closer. Curiosity is the twin of suspicion, and even the most wounded heart longs to know if there is another way. A little boy whispered to his sister, pointing at the still figure by the well. She giggled softly before her mother hushed her, but that giggle was enough to ripple through the air like the first crack in a wall. Aaron remained silent, allowing them their distance. He did not fear their suspicion. He did not resent it. He carried within him the understanding that trust is not granted by speech but by presence. He would not argue for his worthiness. He would let them see it for themselves in their own time, in their own way. The square darkened as the sun fell lower. Lamps began to glow in windows, golden rectangles of light spilling into the dusk. Smoke curled upward as families prepared their evening meals. And yet the air was still heavy with something unspoken. The community wanted to believe again, but fear kept their doors closed. They wanted to hope, but hope had become dangerous. It was then that the real wound of betrayal revealed itself. Not in the broken pots, not in the faded cloth, not in the mistrustful glances, but in the quiet resignation that this was simply how life must be now. Betrayal had not just taken away trust, it had stolen imagination. The people could no longer imagine a world where truth might still exist. Aaron, watching all this, knew that before any healing could begin, that imagination had to be revived. People had to remember that another way was possible, and the first step would not be to convince them with words but to embody it with his presence. He would need to stand long enough, calm enough, true enough, that they could begin to imagine again. The oxen shifted their bells, ringing softly. A breeze moved through the square, stirring dust. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed again, quickly hushed but not erased. The sound lingered in the air, a fragile reminder that joy had not been killed, only buried. This was the landscape of betrayal, a place scarred but not beyond repair. And though the villagers did not yet know it, their healing had already begun. The moment a man arrived who did not demand trust, did not fear suspicion, and did not waver in his stillness. The village had been living under the shadow of deceit for too long. Tonight, for the first time, a small crack appeared in that shadow. The question was whether they would allow the light to come through. The well stood at the center of the square, an ancient circle of stone polished by countless hands that had drawn water over the years. Once it had been the heart of the community, a place where voices mingled in laughter, where stories traveled from one family to another, where every bucket pulled was also a reminder of shared life. Now it stood mostly abandoned. People came, filled their jars and hurried away as if lingering too long might invite another disappointment. The well had become less a gathering place than a reminder of what had been lost. Aaron guided his oxen to stop near the well. He did not speak, did not call attention to himself. He placed one hand lightly on the cart, the other resting at his side, and then he lowered himself onto the ground. Dust rose around him as he folded his legs and settled cross-legged back, straight hands resting calmly in his lap. His eyes were soft but alert. He did nothing more than breathe. For the villagers watching this was strange. Every merchant before had rushed to unpack goods, to shout prices, to wave fabrics or display jars. They came with energy designed to overwhelm suspicion and crush hesitation. But this man did the opposite. He unpacked nothing. He spoke nothing. He simply sat. At first the people were confused. Some whispered that he must be waiting for someone. Others wondered if he was hiding something, a trick to lure them closer. But as the minutes stretched on, the silence grew heavier, and then something shifted. It was not the kind of silence that demanded explanation. It was the kind of silence that asked for patience. Aaron's presence began to ripple outward. It was subtle, like the way a pond responds to a single stone dropped into its center. The ripples were not loud, not dramatic, but steady. A blacksmith slowed his hammering. A woman carrying grain paused just long enough to notice she was pausing. An elder sweeping the square stopped pretending to work and leaned slightly on his broom, watching. There is something magnetic about genuine stillness. In a world of endless motion, of constant selling and persuading, of people performing one version of themselves after another, to encounter someone who wanted nothing was startling. It was like finding clean water after drinking brackish streams for too long. The villagers felt it before they could name it. Suspicion was still there, sharp as ever, but it was joined by something new: curiosity. Even fear cannot keep curiosity away forever, and curiosity is often the first crack in the wall. Aaron noticed none of this outwardly. He did not shift his posture to appear more appealing. He did not smile or nod to encourage approach. He simply remained present, his breathing, even his gaze, steady but soft. In his stillness was a message clearer than words: I will not rush you. I will not demand from you. I will not fight for your trust. I am simply here. A child peeked from behind the corner of a house. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with dirt, and in her small hands she clutched a chipped clay cup. She had been watching longer than anyone knew. Children notice what adults miss, and this little girl had been drawn to the quiet man by the well. She stepped forward cautiously, her bare feet moving across the dust. The crowd noticed her and murmured, some calling softly for her to come back, but she did not. Her eyes were wide, studying Aaron as though trying to understand him in a single look. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, her cup pressed against her chest. Her voice, when it came, was clear and unshaken. Are you the merchant who sells lies? The square froze. No adult would have dared ask so directly. Adults carry too much fear of insult, too much weariness of conflict. But children are different. They speak from the place where truth still burns clean. Aaron did not flinch. He did not laugh or scold or rush to defend himself. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as if he had been given a serious question by a wise scholar. He considered it. Then he answered in the same calm tone with which he might greet the sunrise. "I sell what I have," he said, "and I have no lies to sell." The simplicity of it stopped everyone. The girl shifted the cup in her hands. She frowned, remembering the last merchant who had spoken similar words. His pots had cracked, his cloth had burned her mother's skin. Her question carried not only suspicion but the desperate hope that this time might be different. Aaron saw this and did not try to soothe it away. "You have learned something valuable," he told her gently. "You have learned to ask questions. Questions are worth more than anything I carry in this cart." Then he did something even more surprising. He did not move to show her his goods. He did not rise to perform or impress. He simply gestured to the ground beside him. "Would you like to sit while you ask them?" The square seemed to hold its breath. No one expected this. No bargaining, no persuasion, no attempt to win her trust. Just respect. Respect for a child's suspicion. Respect for her intelligence. The girl hesitated, torn between fear and longing. Slowly she stepped closer, though she did not sit. Her eyes darted toward the cart. "What is in there?" she asked. "Would you like to see?" Aaron responded. He did not move to lift the cloth. He simply asked, and then waited. This was new. Every other merchant would have already pulled back the covering, displaying wares with a flourish, forcing eyes to follow. But Aaron gave her the choice. He placed the power of decision in her hands. That act alone shifted something. For people who had been deceived to be offered a choice instead of manipulation was startling. The girl nodded. Aaron rose with quiet grace and moved to the cart. He lifted one corner of the cloth slowly, carefully, as though he were unveiling something sacred. Inside were simple things: bowls of clay, wooden spoons, lengths of undyed cloth, jars of honey and oil. Nothing shined, nothing glittered, no false beauty to dazzle the eye. "They are plain," the girl observed. Her voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. Aaron nodded. "Yes, plain things have nowhere to hide. They show you exactly what they are." He picked up a bowl and held it out to her. "This bowl makes no promise except to hold what you place in it. It will not change the taste of your food. It will not make your water sweeter. But it will not lie to you either." The girl stared at the bowl, her small fingers twitching as though she wanted to touch it but did not yet dare. Around the square, adults shifted uneasily. They recognized the teaching in his words, though they had not expected to hear philosophy in a marketplace. Truth does not need decoration. Honesty does not need performance. And in a world thick with betrayal, plainness itself becomes a kind of beauty. The blacksmith set down his hammer. The mother who had pulled her child away earlier loosened her grip. The elder, leaning on his broom, allowed his arms to rest. Something subtle had shifted. Suspicion remained, but it was now tempered by a possibility they had not allowed themselves in years. Aaron placed the bowl back in the cart with the same care he had lifted it. He did not urge the girl to buy. He did not press her to believe. He simply returned to his place by the well and sat again as steady as the stones beneath him. The girl lingered. She studied him, then slowly lowered her cup to the ground. It was chipped, the crack running along its side, ready to split with the next drop of water. She looked at him with eyes too old for her years. "Can you fix this?" she asked. Aaron lifted the cup gently, turning it in his hands. "This cup remembers the shape it once held," he said. "Perhaps it is ready to hold something new." The words were not about pottery alone. Everyone heard the deeper meaning. Betrayal may break what we know, but it does not erase the possibility of becoming again. The girl did not smile, but her eyes softened. She did not need him to fix the cup in that moment. She needed to know someone could look at the brokenness without flinching. And Aaron did. Around the square, suspicion cracked just slightly. No walls collapsed. No one rushed forward with trust. But something small had shifted, like the faint glow of dawn before the sun rises. This was how transformation began. Not with shouting or convincing, not with promises or persuasion, but with presence, with stillness, with the courage to let brokenness be seen without shame. Aaron had not spoken of trust. He had not spoken of forgiveness. Yet without naming it, he had given them the first gift of healing. He had shown them what it looked like to remain true, even when met with doubt. The well had been abandoned for years, as a gathering place. But that night, as lamps flickered in windows and families prepared their meals, more eyes turned toward it than had in a long time. Not because water was needed, but because one man had chosen to sit beside it and be present. The evening deepened and the village square glowed with the faint gold of lantern light spilling from open windows. Smoke drifted lazily above roofs, carrying the scent of rice and lentils, of bread baked on stone. Yet despite the comfort of these smells, the atmosphere in the square remained heavy, taut with uncertainty. The little girl had stepped forward, and her chipped cup had been held with respect by the quiet stranger. That alone had disturbed the familiar rhythm of suspicion. But what would happen next was something no one expected. The blacksmith was the first to move. He had been watching with narrowed eyes, his hammer clutched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His forge glowed behind him, iron half-shaped on the anvil. He had been betrayed before by promises of strong tools that snapped at the first strain, by metal that was sold as unbreakable but bent with one blow. Suspicion had become his shield. Yet something about the way Aaron had lifted the girl's cup, something about the way he had spoken of brokenness without judgment, cracked through the wall the blacksmith had built around himself. He walked forward, his boots striking the ground with the weight of decision. The villagers drew back slightly, startled by the movement. He carried a cloth bundle under one arm, and when he reached the well, he unwrapped it to reveal a small bowl, its edge fractured, a piece missing. He placed it gently on the ground before Aaron. "This was given to me last year," the blacksmith said, his voice low, steady but bitter. "The man who sold it swore it would last forever. My wife carried water in it one day and it broke before she reached our door." His gaze was sharp. "Tell me, traveler, what makes your wares any different?" The square-weighted breath held. Aaron looked at the bowl, then at the blacksmith. He did not defend himself with explanations. He did not swear oaths. He reached slowly into his cart and drew out another bowl, plain clay, no shine to distract the eye. He placed it beside the broken one. "This bowl," Aaron said calmly, "does not promise forever. It promises only to hold what is placed in it until the clay can hold no more. Nothing less, nothing more." The blacksmith picked up the bowl, turning it over in his calloused hands. He tapped its side against the stone well. The sound rang clear, firm, no crack spreading through its surface. He tested it again, harder this time. Still it held. A murmur spread through the crowd. "For years," Aaron continued, "you have been offered things that glittered, things dressed in promises too large. I will not offer you that. I will offer you only what is true. Sometimes the truth is plain, but it endures." The blacksmith lowered the bowl, his eyes still suspicious but softer than before. He gave a short nod, a gesture that said he was not convinced entirely, but something had shifted. He stepped back into the crowd, and the murmurs grew louder. Next came a woman carrying a bundle of cloth. She moved quickly, as if the act itself frightened her. She dropped the cloth before Aaron and spoke harshly. "This dye ran the first time I washed it. My hands were stained for weeks. My children wore clothes that left marks on their skin. Tell me, will yours do the same?" Aaron did not recoil from her anger. He reached into his cart and lifted a strip of undyed cloth. He handed it to her and pointed to the well. "See for yourself." She frowned but obeyed, dipping the cloth into the water, twisting it in her hands. She pulled it out, waiting for the telltale streaks of color. None appeared. The cloth remained plain, unchanged. She rubbed her fingers along its surface, then looked at him in silence. Her anger did not vanish, but it softened into something else. Skepticism tempered with the smallest spark of relief. She clutched the cloth and stepped back without another word. One by one they began to approach. A farmer came forward with a jar of herbs that had been sold as medicine for his sick child. The herbs had done nothing. His boy had suffered while hope faded. With quiet respect, Aaron offered a simple jar of honey, explaining that it would not cure every illness but would soothe and strengthen. The farmer tasted it, finding nothing false, nothing bitter. An elder approached with weary eyes, speaking of oil sold as sacred but rancid within days. Aaron unsealed a jar of his own oil, inviting the elder to smell, to touch, to test. Its fragrance was clear, clean, without the sourness of rot. The elder closed the jar slowly, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say more but could not yet trust his voice. Each act was small, but each was a stone pulled from the wall. The villagers did not cheer. They did not rush forward with sudden trust, but they tested. And each test revealed something startling. The man at the well was not lying. His goods were simple, honest, without the false shine of deceit. Aaron never boasted, never insisted. He allowed them to try to question, to doubt. He welcomed their suspicion as though it were a rightful guest. In this way, something rare unfolded. Suspicion was not crushed by force. It was met with patience. Children began to gather near the edges of the square, drawn by the strange sight of adults who were not shouting, not bargaining, but quietly testing and watching. A boy picked up a wooden spoon from the cart when no one stopped him. He held it up to the light, expecting it to splinter like the ones that had broken before. When it did not, he smiled before darting back behind his mother's skirt. The mood of the square began to change. It was not joy, yet not celebration, but it was different. The air no longer carried only suspicion. It carried possibility. People spoke in whispers, not of warning, but of curiosity. Could it be true? Could someone finally be offering them honesty without disguise? As the night deepened, a woman with tired eyes approached, carrying her baby. She held the child close, fear in every line of her body. Her voice trembled. "The last merchant sold me medicine that made my child worse. He told me it was rare and powerful. I gave him everything I had. My baby almost died." She clutched the infant tighter. "What do you have for me?" Aaron bowed his head slightly, acknowledging her pain. He reached into his cart and drew out a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs. "This will not heal every illness," he said softly, "but it will ease fever and calm the stomach. I cannot promise more. I will not promise more. But what I can give, I give, honestly." The woman studied him, tears brimming in her eyes. She did not take the herbs immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for even a flicker of deceit. She found none. Slowly, she accepted the pouch. She whispered a thank you that trembled with both fear and hope. This was how change began. Not with grand speeches or miracles, but with small acts of truth offered without demand. Each villager who tested Aaron's wares found no lies waiting for them. Each one carried back to their homes, not just the object, but the seed of something long buried, the idea that trust might be possible again. Aaron did not celebrate. He did not claim victory. He remained at the well, breathing steadily, allowing the night to unfold. He knew that trust is not won in a single evening. It grows slowly like a tree pushing through stubborn soil. But he also knew that tonight the soil had shifted. The villagers returned to their homes with quiet conversations. Some clutched bowls or cloths. Others carried jars of honey or oil. None of these things were remarkable on their own. What was remarkable was the way they had been offered, without lies, without pressure. As doors closed and lanterns dimmed, the square emptied, but its air felt lighter than it had in years. The well, once abandoned, now carried the memory of something important. People had gathered again, not to gossip or to barter, but to witness honesty. Aaron sat alone beside the well as the stars rose above. The oxen dozed nearby, their bells silent. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest in the moment. He knew that tomorrow would bring new doubts, new tests, perhaps even new opposition. But tonight he had planted something, and in time that seed would grow. The village had not yet healed, but it had begun. Trust had not returned fully, but it had taken its first step. And all because one man had chosen not to fight suspicion, not to deny pain, but to meet both with stillness and truth. The night passed quietly. Stars burned above the rooftops like scattered embers, and the village for the first time in years seemed to breathe a little easier. In the darkness of their homes, people touched the new bowls, sniffed the clean oil, rubbed the plain cloth between their fingers. None of these things were miracles, but none of them lied. For a community long poisoned by deceit that felt like a miracle in itself. Aaron remained near the well through the night, resting lightly, waking with the dawn. His oxen shifted and chewed at bundles of straw, their bells chiming softly in the cool morning air. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern hills, painting the square in gold, children peeked through windows. They were surprised to find him still there, unmoved, patient, as though the night had been only another breath. By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the village. Traders on the road whispered of a man who sold plain goods that did not fail, who did not shout or lie, who simply waited. Some laughed at the idea. Others felt threatened. And one man in particular heard these whispers with burning resentment. He was the very merchant who had once deceived this village, whose cracked bowls and poisoned herbs had scarred their trust. To him, Aran was not just another traveler. He was a threat. The man returned with a cart of his own wheels rattling hard across the same dusty road. His arrival was loud, his voice louder still. He barked greetings, shouted promises, called out to villagers who had once cowered at his approach. His goods gleamed in the sunlight, painted bowls, bright fabrics, jars sealed with colored wax. He smiled wide, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a blade. The square stiffened. People stepped back into shadows, instinct pulling them towards safety. Old fear stirred, mingled now with new uncertainty. The blacksmith clenched his fists, remembering his broken bowl. The woman with the stained hands touched the clean cloth she had been given the night before and frowned. The mother, who had lost almost everything to false medicine, clutched her baby closer, heart pounding. Aran did not rise. He remained seated by the well, his presence unchanged. His oxen flicked their tails and looked calmly at the shouting man. The contrast between the two could not have been sharper. One man frantic with noise, selling glitter and illusion. The other silent, steady, offering nothing more than what he truly carried. The deceitful merchant's voice rang out. "You people are fools. Do you think plain bowls and rough cloth will save you? Look at what I bring. Beauty, color, strength. Do not waste your coin on simplicity when you can have greatness." No one moved. Suspicion lingered, but so did memory. They remembered his lies. They remembered broken promises. Yet fear still held them. Would he punish them for rejecting him? Would his anger bring new harm? Then a small voice pierced the silence. It was the girl with the chipped cup. She stepped forward, dirt still streaking her cheeks, her little hands trembling but her voice clear. "You lied," she said, staring straight at him. "You sold lies and left us broken." The square gasped. No adult had dared confront him so openly, but the child carried no mask, no hesitation. Her words were sharp with truth, unsoftened by diplomacy. The merchant sneered. "Children know nothing. You believe her." He spread his arms, gesturing to his shining cart. "Look at what I bring. These are not lies. These are treasures." But the girl did not step back. She held up the plain bowl Aran had given her. "This one told me the truth. He said it would not last forever, only until the clay gave out. And it has not cracked. He never promised more than it was." The blacksmith stepped forward, his hammer still in his hand, his voice steady. "My old bowl broke before a single day passed. Yours. I tested this one." He lifted Aran's bowl high, and it held. The woman with stained hands unwrapped her cloth. She held it up so everyone could see. "Yours bled until my skin burned. This one does not." The elder lifted the jar of oil he had taken the night before. He unsealed it and let its fragrance drift across the square. "This does not rot. Yours turned sour before the week was gone." Voices rose one after another, each villager stepping from the shadows to speak. Their words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of lived pain and tested truth. For the first time in years, the village did not cower. They stood not just as individuals, but as a community bound together by shared memory and the beginnings of new trust. The deceitful merchant's smile faltered. His eyes darted, searching for weakness. He shouted louder, tried to drown them with noise, but the voices did not stop. Aran still had not spoken. He simply watched, breathing steady, his stillness like an anchor while the storm of confrontation unfolded. He understood that this moment was not his to claim. It belonged to the villagers. They were finding their own strength, their own voices. The child stepped closer, holding her cup like a weapon of truth. "You cannot sell us lies anymore," she said, "because now we know to ask questions." The words struck harder than any blow. The merchant recoiled, his face tightening. He sputtered, shouted again, but no one moved to his side. No one stepped forward to buy. Even the children stayed behind their parents, wide-eyed but firm. Finally, the blacksmith raised his hammer and pointed it toward the road. "Leave," he said. His tone was calm, not angry. It was the voice of someone who had chosen strength over fear. "We are done with you." The merchant cursed, spit on the ground, and pulled at his oxen. His cart rattled as he turned back down the road. His voice trailed into the distance, but no one followed. The square remained silent, filled not with fear this time, but with something new. Pride, relief, strength. The villagers turned their eyes, meeting one another's in a way they had not for years. Suspicion had not vanished, but it had been pierced, and in its place something more powerful had begun to rise. The little girl looked at Aaron. He met her gaze and nodded once as if to acknowledge what she had done. She smiled faintly, the first smile free of fear the square had seen in years. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. The woman folded her cloth. The elder sealed his jar of oil. One by one, the villagers returned to their lives, but their movements carried a new rhythm. Shoulders were not so tight. Steps were not so hurried. The square, once a place of silence, now hummed with quiet conversation. Aaron remained at the well, breathing calmly, his presence as steady as ever. He had not argued. He had not defended himself. He had not needed to. The truth had spoken not through his words, but through the actions of those who had tested and found honesty. That evening, as lamps flickered to life once more, the villagers gathered again at the well. This time not for water, but for each other. They spoke of what had happened, of the courage of a child, of the strength of standing together. They spoke of the plain goods that did not pretend to be more than they were, and they realized something profound: the deceitful merchant had never truly held power over them. Their fear had. Now, with that fear cracked open, they could begin to imagine something different. Aaron listened but did not lead. He let their words flow, let their voices fill the air. He understood that healing is not a gift one person gives another. It is something people reclaim for themselves when they are ready. The night grew deeper. Stars lit the sky. For the first time in years, the well was surrounded not by silence but by community. The sound of laughter, tentative at first, rose and spread. Children darted between adults, their feet raising dust that shimmered in the lantern light. This was the true beginning of transformation. Not the goods in Aaron's cart, not even his stillness by the well, but the moment when the people themselves chose to believe in their own strength again. The village had not known such a moment in years. After the deceitful merchant stormed away in anger, leaving his glittering goods rattling in a cart of empty promises, silence settled once more over the square. But this silence was different from the one that had haunted the place before. It was no longer the silence of fear, of suspicion, of people hiding behind closed doors. It was the silence of something new being born, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time, the villagers looked at each other without lowering their eyes. It was a simple thing, almost unremarkable, yet it carried the weight of transformation. To meet another's gaze without suspicion is to take the first step back into trust. Mothers allowed their children to remain outside for longer, their hands no longer gripping arms so tightly. The blacksmith leaned his hammer against the wall of his forge and joined his neighbors in conversation. The elder with the jar of oil sat on the steps of his house and began to tell stories from long ago, his voice carrying into the evening. At the well, Aaron remained seated, breathing easily, neither claiming victory nor announcing lessons. He knew that what had taken root belonged to them, not to him. He had not forced their eyes open. They had chosen to open them themselves. That choice was everything. As the day passed into night, the villagers returned, not to test his goods this time, but to linger near the well. They spoke softly of what had happened, replaying the moment when the little girl had spoken the truth no one else dared. They spoke of the blacksmith's quiet defiance, of the woman's cloth that did not stain, of the oil that smelled clean, of the honey that soothed instead of poisoned. Each retelling strengthened the story, weaving it into something communal. Stories have always been the fabric of trust. Lies weaken fabric until it tears. Truth strengthens it until it can hold a people together. That night, their fabric began to mend. The next morning, the change became visible. The marketplace, long subdued, opened with renewed life. The blacksmith called out, not with bitterness but with steady pride, as he displayed his ironwork. Farmers laid out baskets of grain, their voices carrying hope instead of weariness. Children darted through the square, their laughter breaking through the walls that had stood for so long. It was not perfect. Suspicion did not vanish overnight. Some still watched Aaron with cautious eyes, waiting for the flaw that might prove them right. But even that suspicion was lighter now. It carried less venom, more curiosity. It was no longer the shield of despair, but the natural caution of people learning to trust again. Aaron continued to offer his wares with the same simplicity as before. No promises, no performance. Only plain goods, plain words, plain honesty. And each time someone tested him, they found nothing false. with every bowl that held water without cracking, with every cloth that stayed true to its weave, with every jar of oil that remained pure, the wound of betrayal healed a little more. The villagers began to do something they had not done in years. They shared, not just goods but confidence. One neighbor told another, "I tried his honey. It was real." Another whispered, "My cloth did not bleed." Slowly trust spread, not because of Iran alone, but because they passed it between themselves. Trust given from one neighbor to another is stronger than any promise from outside. The little girl who had first spoken still carried her chipped cup, but she held it differently now. Where once it had been clutched like a fragile burden, it was now lifted like a badge of courage. She had asked the question others feared, and in doing so, she had opened a door. The villagers began to treat her with a new respect, seeing in her the honesty they had lost in themselves. Children learn what adults forget, that truth spoken plainly has more power than lies wrapped in gold. As the days passed, the square transformed. People once afraid to linger now returned each evening to talk by the well. The well itself, long abandoned as a communal place, became the heart of the village again. Water was drawn, but so too were stories, songs, and laughter. The stone circle that had been only utility now became sanctuary. The deceitful merchant never returned, though rumors spread of his anger in other villages. Perhaps he still sold lies where people were desperate enough to believe them. But here his shadow had been broken, and it was broken not by force, not by punishment, but by presence and truth. Aaron remained only a little longer. He knew that healing was not complete, but it was underway. His work was not to stay and lead, but to plant seeds and allow them to grow. Leadership by dominance fades when the leader is gone. Leadership by example lasts long after the example has walked away. Before leaving, Aaron gathered the villagers at the well. He spoke only once, his words quiet yet clear enough to be carried into memory. "You feared because you were betrayed. That fear was not wrong, but fear does not have to own you. Trust is not given by another. It is something you choose to build together. What I offered was not perfection, only honesty. Hold to honesty even when it is plain. Hold to truth even when it is small, and you will not be broken again." The villagers listened, not as people receiving instruction, but as people hearing the confirmation of something they already knew in their bones. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had felt it in their own hearts. Trust was theirs to create again. When Aaron left, guiding his oxen along the dusty road, no one cried out for him to stay. They did not need to. His presence had done what it came to do. The rest belonged to them. The little girl watched him go, her chipped cup still in hand. She did not feel abandoned. She felt strong. Years later, people would still tell the story of the merchant who sold no lies. They would tell it around fires to children who had not lived through the betrayal, to remind them of the danger of glittering words and the power of plain truth. They would speak of the day a child's voice pierced fear of the night when the village found itself again. The story became part of their fabric, woven into their identity. And beyond the village, the lesson remained. Communities across lands far from this dusty road have felt the same wounds. They have been betrayed by leaders, deceived by markets, fooled by those who put shine above substance. And they too wonder if trust can ever be reborn. The answer is here, in the simple act of presence, in the refusal to force or to flatter, in the courage to let truth speak through what endures instead of what dazzles, in the strength of a child's question, in the willingness of neighbors to listen to one another again. This is not just a story of a village in an ancient time. It is the story of every community that has been broken and longs to heal. It is the story of workplaces where promises are made and broken, of friendships where confidence is betrayed, of nations where leaders lie for power. The costumes change, but the lesson endures. Trust will never return because someone demands it. It will never flourish where deception is hidden behind decoration. It returns only where honesty is lived plainly, where presence is stronger than persuasion, where people allow suspicion to exist without being crushed, but also without being fed. In Europe, in America, in Canada, in every corner of the world, people carry the same question that the little girl carried in her hands. Are you the one who sells lies? And the answer, if it is to heal, must be as Aaron's was, I have no lies to sell. The villagers did not become perfect. They argued still, they disagreed, they struggled with fear. But they had remembered how to gather at the well, how to speak with honesty, how to let trust grow again. That was enough. The chipped cup remained as a symbol not of what was broken, but of what could be reborn. And every time water was drawn into it, the people remembered that truth need not be dazzling. It only needs to endure. The days turned into weeks, and the village began to discover a rhythm it had nearly forgotten. Trust, once fractured, was not reborn in a single night. It grew the way a seed grows beneath the soil, unseen at first, fragile but persistent. Each morning brought with it new tests, small but important, and each evening ended with conversations at the well. What had once been an abandoned stone circle now pulsed with the life of a community rediscovering itself. The blacksmith was among the first to show how trust could be rebuilt through work. His forge had always burned, but the sound of his hammer had carried anger, a bitter rhythm of disappointment. Now his strikes began to change. He forged tools and horseshoes with steadiness, not fury. Neighbors who had once avoided his stall now returned, placing orders without the same tightness in their voices. When he delivered a plow blade that cut clean through the fields, the farmer who received it did not just thank him for the tool. He thanked him for the honesty of the work. The blacksmith nodded, knowing that it was not simply his craft that had changed. It was the spirit in which he offered it. The woman with the cloth did something similar. She washed her new fabric again and again, testing it in front of others, showing them the plain weave held true. At first, her voice trembled when she spoke of it, as though fear might still prove her wrong. But each time the cloth stayed strong, her confidence grew. Soon she was teaching younger women how to test dyes themselves, no longer relying solely on merchants' promises. Do not believe until you have seen, she told them, not with bitterness, but with a calm certainty. Her lesson was not mistrust, but wisdom. Questions are not insults, they are safeguards. The elder with the jar of oil became a quiet symbol of the new life forming. He had once swept the same patch of ground, endlessly trapped in helpless repetition. Now each evening he sat by the well with the jar beside him, allowing others to smell, to taste, to test. He did not hoard the gift. He shared it, saying simply, "The truth is not mine to keep. It is ours to carry." His neighbors listened with respect, for his words held the weight of age and experience. In his small act of offering, the village found a ritual honesty demonstrated openly for all to see. The mother who had once feared losing her child began to smile again. The herbs Aaron had given soothed fevers, calmed stomachs, and though they were no miracle cure, they were what he had promised, nothing more, nothing less. Each time her child's health steadied, she told others, "It worked," as he said. Slowly, her story became a source of hope, not just for healing bodies, but for healing hearts. The little girl, still carrying her chipped cup, became something of a guardian of truth. Children followed her through the square, repeating her words with playful seriousness. "Are you the one who sells lies?" It became both a question and a warning. Adults smiled at the children's game, but they also felt the sting of its honesty. They too began to ask more questions, not with hostility, but with the confidence that suspicion was not weakness, but wisdom when paired with openness. The well itself changed. It no longer stood as a symbol of abandonment. People decorated its edge with flowers. They carved small patterns into the stones, reminders of gatherings. Water was drawn, yes, but now stories flowed as freely as the buckets. The square became alive with voices again. Songs were sung at dusk, old melodies brought back to life by voices that had once only whispered. The air carried not just smoke from cooking fires, but laughter, the unmistakable sign of a people learning to live again. Yet healing was not without challenge. Doubt still lingered, especially when travelers came down the road. Some villagers stiffened at the sight of new faces, afraid the cycle of betrayal might return. But this time, instead of falling silent, they tested. They asked questions. They demanded proof. And when deceit tried to slip past, it was quickly exposed, not by a single hero, but by the community together. One day, another merchant arrived, loud and eager, his cart stacked high with goods painted in bright colors. The villagers gathered, but instead of shrinking back, they approached with steady eyes. The blacksmith asked him to test the strength of his iron before buying. The women dipped his cloth into water to see if the dye held. The elder demanded that jars be opened, smelled, and tasted before exchange. Some goods passed the test, some did not, but the merchant could not deceive them. For every question asked, another villager nodded, and together they reinforced a culture of vigilance paired with fairness. This was the deeper lesson of Aaron's time in the village. It was not simply that one honest man could heal a community. It was that a community could learn to heal itself once honesty was lived, once truth was made visible. The people no longer waited for someone to save them. They had learned to stand guard together, to hold truth like a common well from which all could drink. Aaron himself became less central as the days passed. His presence was steady, but the villagers no longer looked only to him for assurance. They began to look at each other. Trust, once fractured, was no longer fragile because it was no longer dependent on one man. It belonged to everyone. When Aaron finally prepared to leave, the village did not collapse in fear. They gathered at the well, offering him thanks not with desperate pleas but with quiet dignity. The blacksmith gave him a small iron tool forged with his own hands. The woman with cloth offered him a length of fabric dyed with care. The elder placed a jar of oil into his hands, saying, "This is our gift, tested and true." The little girl approached last, holding out her chipped cup. She did not ask him to fix it. She asked him to carry it forward so that wherever he went he would remember the moment when a child's question set a village free. Aaron accepted the cup with both hands, bowing his head in respect. He did not speak much, only a few words that echoed like bells in their memory. "You have learned not to fear your questions. Guard them. They will keep you honest. They will keep you free." Then he turned his oxen toward the road and walked away, his cart rattling softly, his figure fading into the horizon. The village did not feel abandoned. They felt stronger, for they understood now that truth was not carried in a single cart or a single man. It lived in every question they dared to ask, every test they performed openly, every time they stood together at the well. Years later, the story of that time remained not as myth but as memory. Children who had not been born yet grew up hearing the tale of the chipped cup and the plain merchant. They learned that lies wear bright colors, but do not last, while truth often looks plain, yet endures. They learned that when betrayal breaks trust, it is not the end, but the beginning of a harder, stronger rebuilding. And so the well stood carved with flowers and worn smooth by hands that no longer trembled. It was no longer just a place to draw water. It was a monument to the power of presence, to the strength of honesty, to the courage of a child who asked a question no one else would ask. The village flourished not because it became perfect, but because it chose to remain honest. Fields yielded crops, tools endured, cloth held its colors. People disagreed, argued, sometimes even failed, but their disagreements did not fracture them because they remembered what it was to stand together in truth. The lesson of that place spread beyond its borders. Travelers carried the story, telling it in markets and crossroads, in towns and cities. People who had never seen the dusty square spoke of the child with the cup and the merchant who sold no lies. And wherever the story went, it carried the same reminder. Deception breaks communities, but honesty, even plain and unadorned, has the power to heal them. In time, no one remembered the name of the deceitful merchant. His lies faded into the dust of history. But the name of the girl who asked the question and the story of the man who answered with stillness lived on. Because truth once lived becomes part of the fabric of memory. The chipped cup passed from hand to hand became a symbol not of weakness but of strength. Cracked, imperfect, yet enduring. It reminded everyone that brokenness does not mean uselessness. It means the chance to hold something new. And so the village that had once lived in fear became a beacon, not because of miracles or wealth, but because of the simple decision to honor honesty above deception, questions above silence, truth above glitter. Time has a way of softening sharp memories, yet the story of the plain merchant and the chipped cup did not fade. It was not preserved in books or etched into stone, but in something more enduring, the way people lived after him. The village that had once been silent with suspicion carried forward a new way of being. Their story became less about a man who came and more about the choice they made to rebuild trust together. Generations later, children still played near the well, now decorated with carvings and flowers that marked it as the heart of the community. They knew the tale by heart. Parents would point to the stones and say, "This is where we learn to ask questions." Elders would nod, reminding them that the strength of a people does not come from what they own, but from what they are willing to test, to challenge, and to live honestly. The chipped cup remained in the village for many years, passed between families, not as a relic to be hidden, but as a tool to be used. Each time it held water, each time it cracked a little further, it reminded them that even broken things have worth. When the cup finally split and could no longer hold anything, they did not throw it away. They placed it in a place of honor near the well, not for its function, but for its meaning. Children would press their fingers along its jagged edge and listen to the story again, learning that truth is not about perfection but endurance. What mattered most was not that Aran had come, but that the village had discovered a strength within themselves. They had learned that betrayal does not define the end of a community, and suspicion, while protective, cannot become a way of life. They had learned that trust is not handed down like a gift from above. It is built, tested, and guarded by the people who choose it every day. And so the story reached beyond the dusty road, carried by travelers and merchants, by wanderers and storytellers. They told of a village that once lived in fear until a child dared to ask the question no one else would. They told of a man who sat by a well with nothing more than honesty in his cart. They told of a people who learned to stand together, who discovered that truth is not fragile when it is shared. In time, the story found its way across lands and into different tongues. Listeners in distant towns saw themselves in it. A city betrayed by its rulers recognized the weight of suspicion. A workplace where promises had been broken understood the silence that once haunted the square. A family scarred by lies found hope in the lesson of the chipped cup. The story became a mirror, reflecting the wounds of betrayal and the possibility of healing wherever it was told. The lesson was always the same: do not surrender to fear, and do not abandon the questions that protect you. Lies thrive in silence, but they cannot survive when people test, when they ask, when they refuse to be dazzled by glitter. Truth may appear plain, unremarkable, even dull compared to the shine of deception, but it endures. Think of the world now. Think of the promises that flood our screens and our streets. Think of the advertisements that tell us happiness can be bought. The leaders who insist they alone hold the answers. The voices that demand trust without proof. It is not so different from the village before Aran came. Suspicion fills the air, mistrust fractures communities, and people retreat behind walls, weary of being deceived. And yet the story offers us a different path. It tells us that healing does not begin with grand speeches or spectacular gestures. It begins with small acts of honesty, with a bowl that holds water as promised, with cloth that stays true to its color, with oil that does not sour, with a child's courage to ask a simple question. The story also warns us. Betrayal is not just about those who deceive. It is also about the silence of those who refuse to speak. In the village, adults had swallowed their pain, too afraid to confront the merchant who lied to them. It took a child to pierce the fear. How often do we allow lies to thrive because we remain quiet, telling ourselves it is safer to say nothing? The chipped cup reminds us that truth demands a voice, however small, however fragile. Communities, workplaces, families, nations, none of them survive long on deception. The weight of betrayal always crushes the bonds that hold people together. But honesty once chosen and lived can mend even the deepest fractures. The well that was once deserted became the center of life again, not because it changed, but because the people changed how they gathered around it. Our own wells, our meeting places, our conversations, our shared spaces can do the same if we choose to fill them with honesty instead of silence. The chipped cup also carries another lesson. Brokenness is not the end. Betrayal breaks trust. Lies break confidence. But broken things can be held honored, even transformed. The villagers did not hide their scars. They named them, tested them, and in doing so they discovered that trust could be reborn stronger than before. We too can hold our brokenness without shame, using it not as an excuse for silence, but as a reason to demand more honesty in our lives. The story reminds us that presence is as powerful as speech. Aaron never demanded trust. He never argued or shouted. He simply remained still, honest and true. In our world of noise and performance, stillness can feel radical. To be present without agenda, to be consistent without pretense, to live honesty. Instead of selling it, this is what gives others permission to believe again. So, what does this mean for us now? It means that in every relationship, every community, every nation, the choice is ours. We can continue to let fear and suspicion define us, retreating behind walls of mistrust. or we can choose to ask questions to test what we are told, to share honesty with one another. We can become the child with the chipped cup, refusing to accept glittering lies. We can become the villagers who stood together and said, "No more." We can even become the plain merchant living our truth without demand, without disguise. The world is filled with merchants of deceit, but it is also filled with wells waiting to be reclaimed. It is filled with chipped cups that remind us that imperfection is not weakness, but resilience. It is filled with communities longing to gather again in honesty. The story of that village is not just their story, it is ours. And so when betrayal comes, and it will, we are faced with the same decision the villagers faced. Will we hide in silence, or will we ask the question that reveals truth? Will we let lies fracture us, or will we test, speak and stand together? The choice is not distant. It is as close as the next conversation, the next promise, the next moment when someone asks for our trust. The chipped cup still waits, not in a single village, but in every life. Each of us holds it when we doubt, when we fear, when we long to believe again. The question is simple. Will we let it remain broken, or will we allow it to hold something new? The story of Aaron, the chipped cup, and the village that rediscovered trust is not a tale meant to be left in the past. It is a mirror showing us what happens when betrayal lingers, and how communities, families, and individuals can choose to rise again. Every step of the journey, the silence of suspicion, the courage of a child's voice, the stillness of a merchant who refused to sell lies, and the rebirth of a square once abandoned, carries within it a lesson for us today. We live in a time filled with promises that dazzle but rarely endure. Voices clamor for our attention, telling us to believe in their shine, to trust their polish, to surrender our doubts. Yet, like the villagers, we know the weight of broken trust. We know what it feels like to be deceived, to hold something that seemed strong, only to watch it break in our hands. And we know how easily fear and suspicion can become habits that isolate us from one another. But the story teaches us that betrayal is not the end. Healing begins in the smallest of acts. A bowl that holds a cloth that does not bleed, a jar of oil that remains true. It begins with the courage to ask questions even when silence feels safer. It begins with presence, with the refusal to rush, with the choice to stand still and honest in a world addicted to noise. The chipped cup reminds us that brokenness does not mean uselessness. What is cracked can still carry meaning, can still hold truth, can still lead to transformation. Each of us carries cracks from betrayal, disappointment, or loss. Yet those cracks are not marks of failure. They are reminders that we have survived, and that survival can be the foundation of new strength. And so the question is no longer what happened in that village. The question is what will happen in our lives, in our communities, in our nations. Will we allow lies to define us? Or will we choose to gather at our own wells, to test, to question, to share honesty openly? Will we stay silent? Or will we become like the child who dared to speak? Will we chase glittering promises? Or will we honor the plain strength of truth? The call is simple, but it is not easy. It asks us to live with courage, to honor honesty, even when it is plain, to guard our questions fiercely, and to rebuild trust together instead of waiting for someone else to deliver it. Let us not forget the chipped cup, the little girl's voice, or the well that became the heart of a community. Let us carry these symbols into our own lives. For every moment of betrayal we face, we can answer with presence. For every lie we encounter, we can answer with questions. For every fracture we endure, we can answer with truth shared together. Now is the time to choose. Now is the time to stand at our own wells and decide whether we will let fear silence us, or whether we will let honesty guide us. The story has shown us the way. The rest is ours to live.